Hey, we'll see you in Ashland, Virginia, and Athens, Georgia, and Rutherford, New Jersey, and Minneapolis. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for tickets. Hey, do you remember when Trump said this? Do you remember this? Wait, hey, why are you leaving troops in Syria? They asked him.
We're keeping the oil. We have the oil. The oil is secure. We left troops behind only for the oil.
So that's the president of the United States giving the game away, and the whole world saw the president of the United States tell everybody that our foreign policy is based on invading smaller, weaker countries and stealing their natural resources and giving it to Western corporations. It's for the oil. Now, you remember when he did this at the State of the Union with Ron Guaido? He pretended to care about the people of Venezuela. By the way, they always do that under the guise of caring about the people. But now Donald Trump, he just stopped. He was like, it's not about the people, it's about the oil. Well, here he goes in Venezuela. In Venezuela, he's going to tell you he cares about the people.
We are supporting the hopes of Cubans, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans to restore democracy. The United States is leading a 59-nation diplomatic coalition against the socialist dictator of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro.
He's against dictator.
Maduro's a legitimate ruler, a tyrant who brutalizes his people. But Maduro's grip on tyranny will be smashed and broken. Here this evening is a very brave man who carries with him the hopes, dreams, and aspirations of all Venezuelans. Joining us in the gallery is the true and legitimate president of Venezuela, Juan Guaido. Mr. President, please take this message back to your family.
That's the real leader, according to Donald Trump, of Venezuela, Juan Guaido. Now, why do you think he pretended to care about the people of Venezuela at that moment? Why do you think? Well, he just gave the game away about a month ago. Here he is.
We're buying oil from Venezuela. When I left, Venezuela was ready to collapse. We would have taken it over. We would have gotten all that oil. It would have been right next door.
There it is. So that's the game. That's, again, whatever they say we care about people, they don't care about people in our own country. So when the president of the United States says they care about somebody in another country, their people, and democracy, yeah, that means they want to invade them and steal their natural resources. And now joining me is someone who's written a book about this. It's called Corporate Coup, Venezuela and the End of U.S. Empire. It's Anya Parampil. She's a journalist based in Washington, D.C., and a contributor to The Gray Zone. She has produced and reported several documentaries, including on-the-ground reports from the Korean Peninsula, Palestine, Venezuela, and Honduras. The book launch for her latest book, The Corporate Coup, Venezuela and the End of U.S. Empire, is going to be held this Wednesday, May 15th, at OR Books in New York City. Please welcome back to the show, Anya Parampil. Hi, Anya.
Hi, Jimmy. Great to see you.
No, great to see you. Here, I just wanted to let people know how great this book is. Here's some of the blurbs on it. Anya Parampil is one of the most insightful people I've ever met. I'm proud to say I've stolen much of my understanding of the world from her. I can't recommend this enough. Who said that? Tucker Carlson. Anya Parampil's progressive and great journalism on the Gray Zone has been an eye-opener for years. She truly understands the modern world its stakes. Oliver Stone said that. Careful and meticulous work that exposes the dark side of the United States foreign policy towards Venezuela. Parampil epitomizes the best of the American tradition of politically committed investigative reporting that harkens back to the times of Upton Sinclair. Those are big praise for your book. And let me just ask you, what made you want to write this book?
Well, thanks for hosting me, Jimmy. The reason I wrote this book is people are probably very familiar with a lot of my reporting on Venezuela at the height of the Trump administration's fake coup attempt, when there was a lot of drama around Venezuela, when they recognized Juan Guaido as the president of the country, despite the fact no actual regime change had taken place. It was the first time in U.S. history that the U.S. had declared mission accomplished in its regime change scheme before the actual campaign to change the government had succeeded. It was very odd. And there was the fight to protect the embassy, the Venezuelan embassy in Washington. I think that was the first time I ever appeared on your show, was when I was caught up in the midst of that. And so at the time, I had a chance to release a lot of video reports and articles that had to do with the day-to-day reporting and breaking down the false media narratives or about the economic war on Venezuela. And while I did have the chance to put that out there, there was a lot that I wasn't able to put necessarily in just regular articles, personal experiences, and firsthand testimony from powerful people in the world that I'd met over the years. That I felt like the longer I went on covering Venezuela, a narrative began to emerge that isn't just about Venezuela. Of course, I got involved because Venezuela has this kind of mythology in the United States as another country on our continent further south that had this miraculous revolution, reduced poverty, and nationalized the natural resources in the country. So I was interested in it for that reason. But then as I got to know the country and got to know this coup attempt, what I really ended up learning about was, and this is what I say in the introduction to the book, is about the limitations of my own government's foreign policy in the 21st century. The fact that this isn't just about Venezuela. I used Venezuela as a blueprint for understanding the playbook the United States uses to target countries, whether that's Russia, Iran, China. I go into depth about Venezuela because that's what I know. That's what I learned about personally. But I also learned that there is a world that is emerging in opposition to our policy that we really, in the United States, don't understand. That whether it's the move to ditch the dollar now, move away from the petrodollar even, but definitely the move away from using the dollar in international exchange, that's starting to affect us here in the United States now. That's a contributing factor, actually, to inflation that we feel. And so I wanted to be able to tell a full story for Americans about Venezuela and get them to care about it, because of the people that I know there and humanize it, but also for them to understand the stakes, what this means for Americans, and how our fantastical foreign policy, this catastrophe really that we've carried out since the end of World War II of regime change and zero-sum politics, we can't do that anymore. It's over. The world has changed. It's responded to us. It's evolved. And so we need to adapt in our own way.
But it seems like they're not really getting that message. They keep doing the same thing over and over. And even as other power centers develop in reaction to the United States weaponizing the dollar, which is a very bad thing for us because now it's making other countries create their own economic power centers like BRICS. It's making places like Africa want to go off the dollar because if the United States uses it against them, they don't want to be victim to that anymore, right? And including places like Venezuela. Now, tell people. See, here's the thing. People don't realize that Trump didn't only just recognize Guaido, but him and Biden have put sanctions on Venezuela, crippling sanctions. So I always love this. They say, well, socialism doesn't work, right? Well, if it doesn't work, why do you have to sanction the shit out of it? Why can't you just let it fail on its own? Why? So that's the same thing they do with Cuba. They do with Venezuela. If it's so bad of a system, just let it fall to its knees on its own. But that's not what that's about, right? It's about them wanting to steal their natural resources and put in a puppet, just like that's what the foreign policy of the United States has been for, 60, 70, 80 years, since World War II, if not before. And so the result of these sanctions is that life does become miserable for people in Venezuela, to the point of, I think, 7 million people have fled the country. And where do you think they go? They come here. And so Joe Biden has a wide open border. And so could you explain about how this relates to the current migratory crisis? Go ahead.
Yeah, this is not something that even I got necessarily the chance to explicitly write about in the book, but everything that I explain in the book leads us to this crisis that we currently have with the border and with the migration in the United States. It's interesting because when you read mainstream media reports about the Venezuelan migrants that have crossed into the United States over the last 2 years or 3 years at this point, a lot of them just explain that they left Venezuela years ago, probably in 2015, 2016, had spent time in Colombia, Chile, Peru, some of these regional countries that were absorbing Venezuelan migrants at the height of the economic war. The first few chapters of my book are dedicated to really illuminating piece by piece how U.S. economic war works, and in the case of Venezuela. So I think, because it's not only just my opinion, I include studies and a myriad of information, even including analysis from pro-opposition figures in Venezuela. Francisco Rodriguez, whose blurb you read at the beginning there, he's actually an advisor to the last candidate who ran against Maduro in 2018. He's a staunch Maduro critic, completely opposed to the Maduro government, but he had conducted his own research explaining how, through U.S. sanctions, the elite in Washington and their collaborators were able to collapse Venezuela's economy. He describes it as a targeted missile strike on its oil sector, which is all that what Venezuela was dependent on for its economy. And so I don't want to get caught up in the details there. I do think that I make the case clearly in the book that U.S. sanctions are to blame for that crisis. But on the migration point, it's important to understand that a lot of these Venezuelans left in 2015, 2016. Since then, Venezuela's economy has improved, and there's mainstream articles all over Bloomberg, the Wall Street Journal, acknowledging this over the last several years. But what happened is that by then, some of those people had already left. When Venezuela's economy, they had shortages. You might remember there were images of the empty supermarket shelves. Once they got out of that, millions of people had already left the country, but found that life in Chile, Peru, and Colombia, all these regional countries, wasn't that great either. In fact, those U.S. puppet states, in a lot of ways, have similar conditions to that they were experiencing in Venezuela. And then through the COVID experience over the last 2 years, when some of those countries became extremely restrictive, basically shutting down their informal economies during COVID, some of those people ended up going back to Venezuela. But what happened was, within 2 months of the Biden, or 3 months of the Biden administration taking power in 2021, Biden granted temporary protected status to Venezuelan migrants specifically. And this was something that the Guaido regime, the shadow puppet regime that Trump had appointed, was demanding and lobbying for all along. They were begging Trump to do the same. Trump refused because, although he was happy to engage in hybrid war on Venezuela and try to overthrow their government, he understood that granting temporary protected status to Venezuelans would have the direct effect that we're currently witnessing, which is that suddenly all of these Venezuelan migrants spread throughout South America are going to say, we have a free ticket to the United States. All we have to do is get over the border and then we're good to go. And sure enough, Biden came in and granted them that request. And so that is why we saw this influx of Venezuelan migrants specifically over the last 2 years. It is because Biden made a specific choice, policy decision to grant them temporary immigration status. And the Venezuelan lobby, these figures that had made up the Guaido shadow puppet regime representing Venezuela under Trump, at this point, no, they're not taking power in Caracas anytime soon. What they want is for a mass of Venezuelan migrants to come here and serve as their base, so that they basically establish another one of these horrific Cuban lobbies or Israel lobbies, basically a foreign lobby of Venezuelan extremists that are loyal to these right-wing figures from the, or whatever you want to call them, pro-neoliberal figures from the Guaido administration who got them this status, and they will now act as a political bloc in the United States to undermine our sovereign democratic process. It's really dark.
Wow. So what I just heard you say was that there's an immigrant influx of immigrants that are going to vote as a bloc to undermine.
That is definitely the goal of the Venezuela, the figures that represent the Guaido coup regime. And I write about them all in the book. Carlos Vecchio is the main one. He was the ambassador who took over the Venezuelan embassy at that time when some of us were working to actually protect it on behalf of the sovereign government of Venezuela. Carlos Vecchio, I have a whole chapter in the book about him called From Exxon to Ambassador, explaining how he went from a leading lawyer representing Exxon, fighting Venezuela's government throughout the early 2000s, trying to overthrow Chavez as a representative of Exxon, Then he ends up working as Guaido's main coup representative in the United States. His major policy wish, other than pushing Trump to issue sanctions and destroy Venezuela's economy, was to get Venezuelan migrants temporary protected status and then basically open the doors to Venezuelan migrants coming to the United States. Because now, from his perspective, he is nobody in Venezuela. He's never going back to Venezuela. If he does, you would assume he would be arrested for treason because he's actively worked to overthrow the government with a foreign power, the United States. He's in Miami for the rest of his life. He's going to be whining and dining at the Council on Foreign Relations and whatever think tanks want to host him in Washington forever. But he can, and it's just as the Cubans did. They created a base, a right wing, or I'm tired of these labels, honestly, right and left wing in 2024. And I say in the book that I use that for Latin America because right and left wing has very specific meanings. It's like the right is the pro-Chicago Boys U.S. side and the left is whatever resists that. But in the U.S., those things get confused because then you introduce social issues and it doesn't really add up when you apply those labels to Venezuela. So when I say left wing, right wing, that's what I mean in this case. They will have, and because a lot of the people who come here from Venezuela, they might have more neoliberal or liberal views, but they will act as a reactionary base to constantly push our government into confrontation with Venezuela, when in reality, it would be in the interest of the U.S. government to have good relations with Venezuela, to lift the oil sanctions, lower gas prices in the United States. Venezuela was the largest producer of oil throughout much of the last century. We have the existing infrastructure there to begin importing it again, begin refining it again, and pumping it into our gas stations. And yet we refuse to do so purely out of ideology because we think we can achieve regime change. And part of what is driving that delusion in Washington is this Venezuela lobby that now is having an influx of millions or hundreds of thousands of more people that they can say, look, these are my Venezuelan community representatives in the United States. They really want you to continue sanctioning Venezuela. Otherwise, we're not going to vote for you in Florida in November. So that's basically, it becomes this way of holding the American political system hostage through these Venezuelan migrants. It's not necessarily the same way that a lot of people frame how migrants are used in the electoral process, but I think this is a pretty clear example of how the power works.
So there's more oil in Venezuela than there is in Saudi Arabia. And
by a lot.
Yeah. So
by a lot.
And I remember when I first learned that, I knew it was just a matter of time before the United States was going to try to bring their people some democracy. And, so to speak. And so that's exactly what we've been trying to do for at least the last 25 years. So tell me, how do the sanctions on Russian oil and Venezuelan oil relate to each other?
So this is really a fascinating piece of information that I wish Americans understood more, because many of us remember when the Biden administration rolled out its anti-Russia oil embargo in the aftermath of Putin's decision to move forward in Ukraine. That was in February of 2022, March 2022. Remember, it was a big controversy. Even certain members of the squad denounced Biden for making the decision to sanction Russian oil because it was such an obviously dangerous policy if you actually care about Americans, because there's no way that cutting yourself off from an oil provider is not going to result in higher prices at the gas pump. But what people may not remember is that Trump actually was the first to roll out an oil embargo against a major supplier of oil, and that was against Venezuela in 2019. After the United States recognized Guaido as president, Trump basically unleashed this final blitzkrieg against Venezuela's oil economy. It had already been in shambles, but because the United States has historically depended on Venezuelan oil so much, since oil was discovered there just around 100 years ago, to take the step of actually cutting us off, banning the sale of Venezuelan oil in U.S. markets was quite extreme. And Trump decided to do that in a push to install Guaido as president. And I happened upon this graph, which I published in the book in the afterword, showing Venezuelan and Russian oil imports to the United States. And I'll hold it up so people can see, but it's basically like inversely related. So when Venezuelan oil was cut off from the United States in 2019, Venezuela was supplying around 7% of oil imports to the United States. Overnight, after that embargo came up, Russia's share of the US market jumped by 7%. Now, that could be because Russia was selling us extra Russian oil. I think it was probably because Venezuela was selling Russia the oil and they were selling it back to us, just like Europe is doing now with Russia, which is how stupid our policy is. But you can see Russia swallowed up Venezuela's share of the market. That just illustrates it clearly. So what does that mean then when Biden came in and cut us off from Russian oil or Russian supplied oil? That next month is when Biden sent this team of negotiators to Venezuela to begin direct talks with Maduro's government, still refusing to recognize Guaido or dump Guaido as the president and refusing to recognize Maduro's government, even though Biden was in direct talks with Maduro's government at that point. Why were they talking to Maduro's government? Because of oil, because they made a stupid decision cutting us off from Russian oil. They had to go back to Venezuela and say, okay, can we start opening the tap again? But both decisions, whether it's Trump's decision to ban Venezuelan oil or Biden's to cut us off from Russian supplied oil, are catastrophic decisions for the American people. So why are both parties continuing to play with our pocketbooks in order to push fantastical ideology? It only comes down to ideology at this point. Like, Venezuela would actually sell their oil to us. It is crazy people in Washington that just won't allow that to happen.
Yeah, I think, the way I would answer that question is why this American foreign policy actually end up hurting Americans and the people instituting it don't care. It's because the people who are instituting our foreign policy don't care about the American citizens. They don't actually work for us. We see who they work for. They work for the lobbyist groups and the donor class. Right now, look what they're doing in Ukraine and Israel, Gaza, that people don't want any of that. And that doesn't matter. Just like what you said, their policies on sanctioning oil in Venezuela and Russia hurt America. They don't care. They don't care about America. They don't care if there's a civil war in America. Chaos always favors the establishment. So we're being run by criminals, and that's not a hyperbole. We're being run by international criminals who act in the interests of a handful of billionaires and corporations, and that's why we live in an oligarchy, which was proven by the Princeton study in over 10 years now. So your vote doesn't matter. They don't care about you. They don't have to care about you. So they don't care about you, and they only care about the donor classes, which is who they really work for. And we already know that the CIA and the FBI and the NSA, they don't work for the president. So if they don't work for the president, who do they work for? They work for an international class of billionaires. And how do I know that? Because Chuck Schumer said so on Rachel Maddow, that Donald Trump better be careful and not insult the intelligence community because they're going to get back at him. They have 6 ways to Sunday. And they certainly did, right? So 92 felony indictments is one way they get back at him. Russiagate was one other way. Lying to the FISA court 17 times to get a tap on his phone was another way. So they don't work for the president. So you have to ask themselves, who do they work for? Just like Joe Biden, just like the Congress, they don't work for you, the voter. They work for a handful of billionaires, and they work for international corporations. That's who your government actually works for. And that's why their policies injure Americans, and they don't care. That's why there's an open border. That's why we're sending billions and hundreds of billions to Ukraine and to Israel before we take care of our own people here in the United States, before we have health care. Israel has health care. Ukraine has healthcare. The United States citizens don't have healthcare. So, which would change everyone's life overnight, right? We don't have a functioning infrastructure. We don't have a living wage. None of that stuff matters because that's not who they legislate for. So that would be the way I answer it. I just want to show people a little bit about from your book. By the way, I just want to remind everybody, May 15th, this Wednesday, 6 p.m., go see you at the Francis Kite Club, 40 Avenue C, New York. That's at 6 p.m. You're going to be there with Max Blumenthal, Aaron Mate. But I just want to read this part of the book, which I really I liked. There's a couple of parts I really liked. This is one of them. You say, upon walking through the front doors of Venezuela's foreign ministry or a consiglieria in Caracas, one is greeted by a peculiar art installation, which at first glance appears to be a large fractured black trimmed window with a tail stretching behind it. As you gaze past the structure to see what it is labeled the Sala de Salvador Allende or Salvador Allende room, located in the Cancilleria lobby, the towering sculpture's full image becomes clear. It is an artistic rendering of former Chilean President Salvador Allende's glasses.
Allende.
Am I saying it wrong?
Yeah.
Allende, not Allende? Okay, thank you, Steph. My Mexican wife corrected me there. Salvador Allende's glasses left shattered on the floor of his office on September 11th, 1973, after U.S.-backed military forces stormed his presidential palace in Santiago and overthrew his government. Allende died from gunshot wounds, later ruled to be a result of suicide. Yeah, okay. So that's a great reminder. I think that's brilliant that they have that sculpture there to remind you of what the game that's really happening in Central and Latin America and South America. The United States are the thugs, and they come in and they do their they coup and they overthrow and they install puppets, and they don't care if they like military dictators. The United States, turns out, they don't like democracy. They like dictators because they're more reliable, and so that's a pretty that made an impression on you enough that you put it in the book, right?
Yeah, and it's a huge sculpture. It's taller than I am, and it is. Imagine you're working in the foreign ministry in Venezuela. That's what you walk past on your way to the office every day, because it is a constant reminder of the stakes of what happens in Venezuela or in all of Latin America when these forces that have worked to overthrow sovereign governments in Latin America for decades win. And Venezuelan officials know that those stakes, because throughout the 60s and 70s, their country faced a similar dirty war against left-wing or anti-neoliberal guerrilla groups in Venezuela, and their neoliberal government cracked down violently, militarily against these groups, but also worked to repress just any aspect of democratic life in Venezuela for decades. And so some of the figures that serve in Venezuela's government now are the children of people who participated in the resistance to their version of a junta or neoliberal junta government in Venezuela, including the vice president, Delcy Rodriguez. Her father was actually a student militant who participated in the struggle against Venezuela's U.S.-backed neoliberal government and was assassinated, killed, tortured to death by the government in previous decades. And so those glasses, it's not a relic of the past when they're looking at something like the coup against Allende in Chile. It's more of like, this is what we're up against now. If we fail or if the government falls, that evil is what comes back into power in Venezuela.
And so I just want to, not only is the book filled with great information and it helps people understand the world in general, not just Venezuela, but it really does help people understand Americans' foreign policy and the consequences. Mm-hmm. But it's also, it's got beautiful writing in it. And I just want to share this little part of it. You say, during the 40-minute ride from Venezuela's seaside airport to its capital, the bright blue hue of nigh Caribbean waters blurs into tropical greenery as the highway twists through serene coastal mountains before giving way to the unmistakable combustion of city life. Descending into the explosive metropolis, Caracas first spills out from either side with rainbow-speckled barrios that tumble down the edge of its surrounding hills. Suddenly, the colorful commotion of the neighborhoods is replaced by the frenetic industrial energy of downtown, a whistling mix of modern skyscrapers and brutalist government buildings sprouting amidst archaic compounds adorned with delicate arches and wraparound balconies reminiscent of imperial Spain. The intractable pulse of the city center is only reined in by the
Cordillera.
Cordillera de la Costa Central mountain chain, magnificent emerald slopes that encase Caracas's rolling urban heart. It was such a beautiful description and so well written. I just wanted to share that with people to let them know. It really gives you really made me, it gave me a flavor for being there. Unlike anything else. I mean, I've actually been to Venezuela.
Oh, yes, we were.
And
when did you go?
I was
2000, right?
Yeah, it was a long time ago. We were on a cruise ship that stopped there, and so we didn't really see much of it.
That was an exciting time. That was right when Chavez's government first came in. So, wow.
I think it was in 2000.
You were there for history, Jimmy.
Wow. Yeah. Look at that. Anyway, yeah. So I've been there. I've been a lot of places. Anyway, but that's everybody. I just want to remind everybody. Anything else you want to say about your book that we haven't said? I want to remind everybody to go see this Wednesday, 6 p.m. You can check out Anya, Max Blumenthal, Aaron Monte at the Franklin Kite Club, 40 Avenue C, New York. Anything you want to say about the book that I haven't?
No, I think that we summed it up. It's not just about Venezuela. It's about our changing world. And so I want to give a positive message also just for the future of our country. We can survive. We can adapt to this multipolar world. The rest of the world wants us to. We just have to learn how to behave like adults.
Okay. Yeah. Well, good luck with that. Really, seriously, especially the people who are in charge. They're all maniacs. Of the highest order. I mean, even when Trump got in, he got in because he had a non-interventionist policy. He told people when he wasn't going to do these wars, and then he surrounds himself with people like John Bolton. And
I will mention, just because you did bring that up, I actually get some insight into Trump's real opinion about Bolton and Venezuela that I share in the book, based on a source that you might be able to guess, whose name also appears in the blurbs of the book.
Well, now I want to know. Tell me what is
Tucker? Tucker goes on the record briefly in the book to talk about Trump. It was actually when I was in. You may remember that I went on Tucker's show on April 30th, 2019, which was the day of that fake military uprising when Guaido actually tried to lead a. Yeah. So Tucker had me on that night and to say, like, Trump he promised to drain the swamp, but he brought in Bolton and Abrams and all these psychos. And I wasn't the only one who spoke out against Trump's policy that night. Colonel Douglas McGregor did. And Tucker himself gave this long mono about why it was bad. And so a few days afterwards, I was locked inside the Venezuelan embassy during like this struggle to protect it from a State Department takeover. And Tucker called me. And he said, "Oh, just so you know, like our segment was the highest viewed on Fox that night. It was super well received. And then everything immediately dropped when Sean Hannity came on a few minutes later with ratings. But he said that Trump also called me after the show and said that he agreed with my personal take on it. Not mine necessarily, but he agreed with the whole show that Tucker had put together on Venezuela. And he said, and this is what Tucker told me at the time, was if I listened to John Bolton, I would already be in World War III, IV, and V, but I keep him around to kind of scare people off. Obviously, I think that backfired against Trump because Bolton effectively undermined him, or Trump allowed him to undermine him too much. But that story then matched with other reports that we got in the Washington Post of someone saying that after that military coup attempt, when Guaido was so badly embarrassed, that Trump was just totally frustrated, feeling that Bolton had lied to him about the possibility of this regime change act. And Bolton later wrote that afterwards, Trump started describing Guaido as the Beto O'Rourke of Venezuela. And other Trump administration officials too, including Bolton, write about how Trump then repeatedly expressed his wish to sit down with Maduro and solve our problems with Venezuela directly. And so the fact that I had that insight already based on what Trump had personally said to Tucker, and then I saw so many other reports that backed it up, I just think it added some layers to my understanding of how the White House works, how Trump works, and yeah, any president is clearly up against a lot. And that's not an excuse because obviously Trump made some horrible decisions. But I think we really don't understand that the president doesn't control our country at all. I mean, look, that's why they have Biden in there right now.
That's right.
Telling us that it doesn't matter who's in the White House.
Yeah, it really doesn't. They're going to try and get their way. Although Trump was a major speed bump, just like he said, if he would listen to the Antony Blinkens and the John Boltons, we would have already been in World War III and IV, which they've been trying to start since the day Joe Biden got in office.
Blinken might have already, I mean, maybe we'll look back on this period as World War III, honestly.
Yeah, no kidding.
Blinken got us into.
All right. Great book. I'm really happy for you, and I hope your book launch on Wednesday goes great. Hey, we're doing stand-up in Ashland, Virginia, Athens, Georgia, Rutherford, New Jersey, Minneapolis, Minnesota, Ontario, California, Irvine, California, Las Vegas, Davenport, Iowa, Chicago, Grand Rapids. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for tickets, and make sure you go to jimmydore.com and don't go to a second reseller. Not good.